Good morning, colleagues. This is Amanda de Preez from South Africa, and yes, it's morning on my side of the universe. The topic that I would like to discuss today is the space persona, or how to astronaut. But before I do that, I would like to thank the editorial board of Persona Studies for inviting me to do this talk, and specifically for Kim Babur for inviting me. And I hope that my contribution will aid in expanding the research on persona studies and also in diversifying the field. So let me start without any further ado with my presentation. Now, as we all know, outer space still remains the vast unknown, or the last frontier that beckons gravity-weary travelers. And it's often predicted that our species' future will unfold in this uncharted cosmic terrain. However, it is a journey that is only meant for the brave and for those who are prepared to challenge their fears of the unfamiliar and even to the extreme. So in 2019, we celebrated the 50th anniversary of the Apollo 11 moon landing, and also in the previous year, 2018, we celebrated the 50th anniversary of 2001 Space Odyssey by Stanley Kubrick, released in 1968, which is probably still the gold standard in terms of representing outer space. But for my discussion, I want to link two discourses that has been linked previously, namely the image and the persona. So I'm going to start with this quote. And it says, what we do today depends on our image of the future rather than the future depending on what we do today. In other words, this statement tells us that the image is a very important structure or defining metaphor for how we think about the future. So in terms of the image persona link that I want to pursue in my argument, I've made the following slide to clarify the relationship as I see it. In other words, I argue that image and persona, they have a direct link and they can be associated. The argument being that the image, after all, appears and thus represents, just like the persona also appears and mediates. So both image and persona operate between presentation and representation, and this is an argument that is also taken up by David Marshall in his discussions on the social media personas specifically, that I also now elaborate on. Now, the image of the astronaut has become very popular, and I would even say that there's a type of urgency in the current representation of the astronaut. So we see the astronaut represented in advertisements, online memes, album covers, and I've just selected a few that I think is quite interesting, and also because I am quite interested in album covers, and I think they're quite representative of the kind of trend and the popularity of the astronaut. However, for my discussion, I am more interested in the filmic astronaut, or let's say the astronaut that appears on the screen. And we also had an avalanche of films recently, and I'm just sampling a few. The Martian 2015, Approaching the Unknown, First Man 2018, Ad Astra 2019, Lucy in the Sky 2019, and then The Midnight Sky in 2020, directed by George Clooney. So we can see that the theme of the astronaut is very popular also in television series like Mars 2016, Away 2020, and Stowaway 2021. And the astronaut selfie is also, or the space selfie, is likewise infiltrated social networking sites since Hoshide, the Japanese astronaut, first shared his selfie during a spacewalk in 2012. But what I would like to do here is, as I already indicated, is to work with the image and see what that tells us about our relationship with place, space, and time, also our relationship to Earth. So the astronaut will figure as a very important symptom of our relationship with Earth. So the purpose here is to explore the image of the contemporary astronaut, particularly the screen renditions, as I already said, as an agent that performs or reveals ideas and perceptions about human mobility and displacement in the Anthropocene. Now, some of these ideas and images are competing and opposing. In other words, I'm not saying they're all the same. There can be differences, and they may be competing and even opposing. But there is a dominant trope that can be identified, namely that of the lone heroic explorer in the surface of expanding human knowledge and horizons. And then the essence of my talk would be to ask what the image of the astronaut makes visible, is to ask what idea is represented by the image of the astronaut. Is it possibly a hopeful eagerness to expedite our extraterrestrial and exobiological future? Or, moreover, what type of world, in the Heideggerian sense, is summoned through the image of the astronaut? And here I've made a plan, or I have taken certain ideas that I find important in plotting or mapping the image of the astronaut, and I've identified a few attributes of the astronaut, and I will, as you can see, we'll see in my talk as it develops, build on these attributes and expand on them. Now, obviously, the astronaut is associated with the heroic, and I've already indicated that. Brave, definitely a celebrity, a global celebrity, to be quite specific. An element of detachment, or being detached. Asexual, and perhaps for viewers this will sound strange, but we will unpack that. Post-human, sorry, there's an error in my spelling there, being post-human. Supernatural, and then specifically in terms of persona studies, impersonalized, and I also hope to unpack that further. Being disorientated, and when I refer to this, obviously I'm referring in terms of place, space, and time, and also being displaced in terms of Earth and place, time, and space. Good. Let's start with the first few attributes that I've identified, which would be the heroic, the brave, and the celebrity aspects of the astronaut, which would also include, of course, the racial and gendered aspects of the astronaut. So, as I've already indicated, that in going beyond our terrestrial boundaries, a unique agent is required. And we've already also said that he needs or she needs to be brave and unwavering in the confrontation of the unknown frontier. Now, the astronaut, or the term means star sailor, is precisely such an emissary. And it's especially in the milieu of post-war American new frontierism and the Soviet Union cosmism that the astronaut becomes a mythological creature. However, the early astronaut is not solely a creature of myth and fantasy, but also an embodiment of the courageous soldier combined with notions of the intrepid, although peaceful explorer, while simultaneously being, and I quote, chaste but an alluring sex symbol. So there's a paradox already indicated. So the outstanding quality of the early astronaut image is therefore a blend of fiction and fact, so it's science fiction and science fact that are bound together. And as constructions of our imaginations, the astronaut has become a global celebrity and a cultural icon of courage. So it's someone to be admired and even secretly to envy. Now, if we consider the concept of celebrity suggests to have a star quality and someone who ascends into the heavens. In the case of the astronaut, the celebrity status is quite befitting them. In this sense, the celebrity and the astronaut hover above and beyond our earthly and everyday existence.
What I show online or on the screen are sources that could be helpful in unpacking the heroic nature of the astronaut, the celebrity status, and also the fact that the astronaut combines both myth and fact in their embodiment. Now, in accordance with the period imagination then, which was called the so-called heroic era of human space flight, which stretched roughly from 1957 to 1986, the astronaut was clad during that period with fantasies of hypermasculinity and of pioneering heroism. The heroic phase, however, would come to an end after the Challenger disaster in 1986 and introduce the age of a more comparative or cooperative space missions. Now, during the heroic phase, analogous to the Wild West, outer space is constructed as the final frontier and in the now over-familiar anthem of boldly going where no man has gone before. But as we know, space, like air, is not empty nor uncharted, but it is unlocked by humans through language. Therefore, space science and space are always already gendered territory and thus colonized by gender. And here I use Mary Lather's book and arguments to elaborate on the idea of what happened to women in How to Astronaut or during the space race. So women were by default negated or not included, and the main argument being that their natural status or their link to with Earth excluded them from partaking. So it was quite a battle for women to be included in space adventures, and there was a short flirtation during the 60s to think about women astronauts, and terms were used such as astronaut, astronautess, astronautrix, and cosmonaut. Now, needless to say, these terms did not catch on, and I don't think it's any wonder that they did not catch on. Currently, it is the gender-neutral astronaut that applies to all genders in the major space agencies, except naturally for the Russian Space Agency, who refer to their astronauts as cosmonauts. When Mary Lathers reminds us that space is always already colonized by gender, it includes race as well. For the first black African stepped aboard a space plane only in 2014, and the term Afronaut was loosely used to refer to the first African in outer space, but the concept has a richer meaning, coupled with cultural aspirations and utopian dreams of a possible African future, or an Afrofuturism, if you like. Therefore, the Afronaut is a powerful icon in Afrofuturistic narratives of what has been, what could have been, and what is yet to come. The context from where the dream of the Afronaut is projected during the short-lived Zambian Space Academy in the 1960s to 1969 differs greatly from the tone and consequences from the Western and Soviet versions, for instance, and I acknowledge that. We are confronted here more with an enchanted vision, although perhaps a more chaotic one as well. Now on screen you see the image or a clip from the video, The Afronauts, which was directed and released in 2014, directed by Notama Francis Bedomo, and it retells the story of this African aspirational adventure. The selected Afronaut to represent her continent befalls here on the shoulders of the 17-year-old Mata Mwamba. You see her here on screen, and she was played by Deandra Forrest. We see Mata doing weightless training for outer space, in barrels being rolled down hills and being hauled in the air from a blanket. Mata is treated as a spiritual being. She is the messenger from Africa, and her name is chanted, and we hear this in the video. Mata, the mother of the exiles. Before she exits, she's instructed, tell them we are coming. Do not impose Christianity on them. Do not impose the nation states on them. So Mata's not going with a flag to make her claim, like the two Americans staking their claim on the television that we can see in the background. Mata is here a representative to initiate a new time and space beyond the borders and divisions of her earthly abode. So I'm sharing the example of the Afronaut and Mata specifically to show a different perspective on the heroic and the typical idea that we have of the astronaut. Now, from the magical Afronaut Mata towards the post-human and the superhuman, the next part of my discussion deals with the fact, and I think many listeners are familiar with this, the first cyborg was linked to the idea of the astronaut, and this was obviously done by the two gentlemen who coined the term the cyborg, Manfred Clynes and Nathan Klein, in their essay called Cyborgs in Space in the 1960s. And what they did in this first scientific study was to show how the human body can be altered to adapt to space travel and extraterrestrial environments. So Clynes and Klein proposed that space travel invites man to take an active part in his own biological evolution. So what we see here is the astronaut becoming a being that exceed, or becoming beings that exceed their humanness. But not only are astronauts superhuman or post-human in the fact that they exceed their own humanness through technology and technological enhancement, they're also seen as supernatural. And that was especially in prehistoric encounters where they are identified as angelic or alien beings, and also in Arthur C. Clarke's reading of the astronaut. The astronaut's victory over gravity is the testament to the supernatural nature of the astronaut. Now, for Clarke, one of the most influential advocates of the 20th century for the exploration and colonization of space, for him, gravity is the consequence of original sin and should be overcome as it keeps us locked in what he calls an earth-bound slavery. He says that our innate attraction to flying and becoming weightless is part of our struggle to overcome the mysterious force of gravity. The astronaut launched into outer space overcomes gravity and is therefore, according to Clarke, redeemed. What we've done so far is to look at the astronaut as a heroic, brave being with post-human and possibly supernatural abilities, and it also depends on which sources you consult on that. And also we've looked at the fact that the astronaut usually has a specific sex, gender, and race. What I want to do now is to stand in front of the astronaut and to ask, what do you see when you look or when you encounter the astronaut? And on screen you have an image of first man, and you have the opportunity now of looking at the astronaut or encountering the astronaut. The archetypal astronaut, I would say, is depicted usually as full frontal, donning a spacesuit with an impenetrable visor that deflects harmful radiation. The visor also acts, unintentionally perhaps, as a mirror that reflects the astronaut's horizon or whatever appears in his horizon. The human face, or the humanity, of the astronaut recedes behind this dark mask provided by the helmet's solar sheet. Similarly, the human voice is changed through the technological device to traverse the vacuum, further confirming the astronaut's cyborgian status. No markers identify the astronaut as male or female, queer or straight, black or white, nor as happy or sad, for that matter. If it's true then that if we stand in front of the astronaut, that it's very difficult to tell his or her true identity because we can't tell from the spacesuit or from the impenetrable visor who the person behind this mask really is. What will happen if we take that further and we start interpreting the astronaut as an impersonal being? So rarely do we find the astronaut's true identity revealed, since the astronaut is regularly depicted not as a being with distinct attributes, as we just saw in my discussion, but as one that moves closer to becoming what I would call a reincarnation of Robert Musil's book, The Man Without Qualities. Now, in Musil's novel, the main character, Ulrich, is the man without qualities. He's a modern man who embodies the threshold between what is possible and what not. And I quote, "Against the realities of the society in which he lives, Ulrich permanently comes up with other possible realities." In this opening created by the possible realities, Ulrich's character considers the meeting between rationality and the imagination, objectivity and subjectivity, and science and spirit without making a choice. Even the notion of the self is contingent because the relationship we have to ourselves, to our own characteristics and qualities, is contingent. Accordingly, he understands himself as a man without qualities. He exudes no particular qualities, just like the astronaut, because he's not tied to any or is not possessive about any of these specific qualities. This indicates that when reference is made to a man without qualities, it is not so much that to deny that he exhibits any definite qualities, but rather to suggest that whatever qualities he displays are not really his. Ulrich's lack of own qualities and a personal center is constructed as a form of radical depersonalization and even as a form of impersonality. Now, in Musil's novel, time and space have also become contingent, interchangeable, negligible, just as the past, present, and the future also merge. Reality recedes, and the man without qualities soars aloft, groundlessness ungrounded. As there is no ground to reflect from or on, the groundless state paradoxically again leads to a form of inertia, a state that cannot produce any behavior. Tied to this inertia and his inability to act, Ulrich can also be typified as a nowhere man, precisely because he is going nowhere. He is always right, but never productive, never happy, and never except momentarily engaged. And here the image of the hyper-mobile elite comes into focus again. Those travelers who find their home everywhere and nowhere. Similar for Musil, it was only through modernity's groundlessness and homelessness that one will be able to open one's potentialities, or even to be able to live as a matrix of potentialities. Thus, Musil's faceless man is just like the astronaut. So that was some ideas about the possible impersonality of the astronaut. What if we look at the place of the astronaut? And I have identified the astronaut as being a creature that is displaced. And the reason for that is I am asking, how is the astronaut depicted or positioned in terms of Earth? Now, compare, for instance, and you can see on screen, Buzz Aldrin's space selfie, taken already in 1966, with that of the Japanese astronaut Hoshide, taken 36 years later in December 2012. The orientation towards Earth shifts dramatically in these images. Buzz Aldrin's pre-moon selfie captures the status of a very excited astronaut who has in some sense overcome time and space. A creature which is, and I quote Paul Virillo here, who is less in the world than out of the world, looking back from the outside to Earth. We see Aldrin's half-lit face with Mother Earth in the background, but he has eclipsed the pull of gravity since Earth no longer represents the center of his existence, but has become a mere spectre on the horizon. The instant captured in this nascent selfie could on some level again be interpreted as the birth of a new type of man, linking the astronaut once again to the supernatural or to the post-human. He could be linked to a new type of man as a skywalker, the man beyond Earth, a post-Earth creature. Aldrin's self-portrait aims to seize this momentous event by declaring an awareness of this changed status. With a slight frown on his forehead, Aldrin stares into the future of humanity, while Earth hovers in the background. Compared to Buzz Aldrin, in Hoshide's case, we can no longer see his face, since any trace of his appearance or personality disappears in this image, as the reflective visor shows us only what he is looking at, namely the International Space Station, and below it the Earth. Earth can no longer be seen drifting serenely in the background, but is now displaced to merge with Hoshide's face instead. Now, as Virillo suggests, the world is no longer before us, but is now behind us as we travel towards extraplanetary emancipation. Whereas the reference axis used to be the center outside of the self towards Earth, it is now shifted inside as protruded man turns into a planet, onto himself. What is rising behind Hoshide's shoulder is the sun, and it's shining like a giant spotlight, and it's no longer Earth that we can see. The hubris of Icarus, foretold by the myth, is now embodied in the astronaut who no longer has Earth in view, but instead has his sights on the sun. If the astronaut is displaced, as we've just been discussing, it probably goes without saying that he is also disoriented. And this disconnection and disorientation from gravitational references is asserted by Barry Butch Wilmore, his recent picture that you can see on screen, taken on February 21st, 2015, which is announced as a truly out-of-this-world picture taken during a spacewalk. Now, Wilmore's picture is snapped by a fellow astronaut, Terry Wirtz, and we can see Wirtz dangling upside down in Wilmore's visor if you have a close look. The image becomes an image within an image, or an image reflecting on the status of images. That's what W.J.T. Mitchell dubs a meta picture. The vanishing points of the illusionary perspective have imploded on the surface of the image. The orientation regarding up and down, below and above, has become confused and no longer matters, as Wilmore's is a centrifugal being that is no longer drawn to the center. Instead, he is now drifting aimlessly and effortlessly in all directions. And the perplexing thing is that it's almost impossible to tell the difference between Hoshide and the previous slide and Wilmore's images, except perhaps for the identifiable USA flag on Wilmore's suit. For the rest, both are arcane nowhere man, or men, or beings without defining qualities. This is because the astronaut embodies a nomadic identity that avoids a recognizable affiliation with cultural norms and standards. In spacewalking, the astronaut is no longer falling down, but also now falling up, as the reference axis to our any gravitational location has been disconnected. But it's not only the gravitational references that are left behind in spacewalking, but also Earth's spatio-temporal references. Now, if up and down has no more scientific meaning, it is interesting to look at the example of the film Approaching the Unknown, where we see the stoic Captain Staniforth traveling to Mars to bring life to it in his own words. Now, the film focuses mainly on Staniforth's progression and decline into solitary confinement. His sense of time and place becomes distorted, and he writes in his diary, "I can't tell if I'm moving." He's caught in a dead center of inertia. The speed at which he travels has no phenomenological meaning to him. Even more astonishing, during a conversation with his fellow female astronaut, Captain Emily Maddox, on her way to join him in setting up a base for a future colony as a complementary Eve to his Adam, he relates a dream, and he says, "I had a dream that I was falling. Ironic, don't you think?" he asks. To which she quickly responds, "It's not a dream, you are falling." Now, if up and down, as I already said, have no scientific meaning in outer space, then why does the astronaut dream of falling? Does his body remember or remind him of Earth, where falling is inevitable? I'm now moving into the final of the conclusive parts of my presentation. The last slides will deal with the topic linking with being displaced and disoriented, with the topic of terra incognita. And here I will use comparative slides or images to expand on my ideas. Now, so far as we know that outer space is an exploration of an encounter with a frontier, and thus a pioneering endeavor of facing a border, a limit, an ender, it is also often cited as terra incognita. Now, I would like to conclude with a discussion of comparative images that unlock the pioneering encounter. Once again, and I often use this image by Caspar David Friedrich, Wanderer Above the Sea Fog, from 1818. It still serves for me as a leitmotif of a repeating visual trope that embodies this liminal meeting between pioneer and frontier. The fact that Friedrich's visual formula is used repeatedly suggests that it acts as a placeholder for this type of event. It participates in what I would call, and here I borrow from Abby Warburg, it participates in a pathosformulum, according to which images, their essence travels between different periods and contexts, various mediums and platforms. Friedrich's figure acts as a pictorial formula that has an afterlife or a Nachleben, as it survives beyond the point of creation. The internalized images particularly conveys a specific vantage point that reads time, space and place as yielding to the subject's intentions. I want to take my cue now from Abby Warburg's ideas about images that have afterlives, and using Caspar David Friedrich's Wanderer as an image to be read back into recent images that depicts the astronaut and the encounter with a frontier. So in the image online or on my screen that you've already probably identified, it comes from The Martian. And now in The Martian, the marooned astronaut Mark Watney, played by Matt Damon, he travels across the Mars landscape in a rover while inspecting the foreign territory and reflecting, and he says, "Everywhere I go, I'm the first. It is a strange feeling. Step outside the rover, first guy to be there. Climb that hill, first guy to do that. 4.5 billion years, nobody here. And now me." Now, the newness and the strangeness of the whole encounter engulfs him. To be the first human to experience this ancient and vast landscape is truly sublime. The rhetoric of originality and novelty also can be picked up in the example of Captain Staniforth's encounter with Mars in the film Approaching the Unknown. Now, as the first human on the red planet, he reflects as following. He says, "Nothing has ever lived here. Nothing has ever died here. Maybe I'll live forever." Both examples evoke an ontological shock and amazement upon experiencing the threatening, the thrilling unknown. In terms of a visual formula, the camera follows Captain Staniforth from the spacecraft after landing into the pristine landscape. The viewer can also only see his back, as we can see in the Friedrich case, as we trail behind him in experiencing the cosmic sublime meeting between human and terra incognita. And the same formula is utilized in the Martian's case, as we see Watney from behind, exploring the new terrain with an almost childlike playfulness. I conclude. The images that I've looked at, what they reveal, and I refer here to the images specifically of the astronaut being displaced, disoriented, as an impersonalized entity, and the astronaut encountering terra incognita. What they reveal is that while leaving the Earth behind is a grueling effort, and it puts the astronaut to the ultimate test, especially of bravery. We see that it can be done. This is because the dominant myth supports the idea that, and I quote from the recent film Ad Astra, "Up there is where our story is going to be told." Therefore, remaining on Earth apparently calls for no heroic glory or confrontation with the abyss. It is only post-Earth where astronauts are turned into ascending gods.
Thank you everyone for listening to my ideas about the astronaut and outer space. And I hope that this will start a debate on the image and the persona and linking this to the space persona.